Right, so just before we sink into this, I've got a confession to make to the listeners and what have you, that as my dissertation deadline, should I say, is impending, I have been subjecting myself to a hell of a lot of late nights, and my sleeping pattern is absolutely obliterated. So if I do come across half dead at times during this, that'll be why. But the man joining me for this podcast, my guest, I am convinced he could sell ice to an Eskimo. So Ian, I know you hold
allegedly.
Allegedly. Ian, I know you hold two executive positions across two different companies. So could you just explain them, please?
Yeah, sure, Max. And don't worry if you fall asleep. Most people that listen to me end up falling asleep. So yeah, I'm managing director of George Wicks Limited and the Effective Communication Group. I own both businesses. They're similar to an extent, but the sectors that they ply their trade in is different. So George Wicks Limited is essentially a platform of investment and commercial opportunities throughout the professional football sectors across the globe and other professional sports sectors. Investment opportunities would be, if we applied it to the football industry, acquiring a stake in a football club, for example. Commercial opportunities would be high-profile sponsorship deals, so sponsoring stadiums for the naming rights, front of shirt sponsorship opportunities. We, as I explained earlier, we did the deal at Sheffield United recently, sponsoring on the sleeve. Any commercial opportunity to extend and expose the brand across the globe, because it's the most lucrative commercial sports sector in the world. And in addition to the investment and commercial opportunities within the platform at George Wicks Limited, there's also football operations services, and I mentioned we endeavour to open more doors for Michael Owen's Red Stars football project across the world, with discussions in China, Kuwait, Nigeria, and we hope to get one of those off the ground. So George Wicks Limited, investment and commercial services across the professional football sector and other professional sports sectors. The other commercial interest is the Effective Communication Group, and it essentially provides the same range of investment and commercial services, but across any other sector. And one of the ones in which we tend to enjoy most success is retail, because traditionally and historically the arena in which people buy and sell in business is retail. Even though we hear that the high street is suffering, retail online is booming. So whether it's on the high street or whether it's online, people still want to get their products and services into retail, and that would be one example where we provide a range of investment and commercial services. So,
brilliant. Something that I've got to say as well, I have had 2 masterclasses from Ian on both commercial interests, and he's brought to my attention a series of really interesting key points. First, on the Effective Communications Group, something that I think ties into definitely my interest, I'd say, is the effective utilisation of language, being the written word and the spoken word, which I feel essentially accumulate why I do this podcast, really. I feel like it is such an effective marketing technique. It provides so many different networking opportunities, and I've met a hell of a lot of people that I wouldn't have otherwise met. So, that's basically one of my prime motivations for being a host of a podcast. And something that I want this podcast in particular to focus on is the interest in the commercial sports sector, because ever since I was knee high, it's all I've wanted to work in. I've just infatuated with football, obsessed with not just playing, but the commercial side of things and what have you. Something that I do feel was particularly interesting that I wouldn't mind asking you about is this relationship that's come about with Michael Owen, because I feel like investors in the world of football, obviously there's plenty of examples of investments going awry and not flourishing into what they would have envisioned. I think one of the finest examples of investment in football is where we currently are. We've got a pitch side view at the Etihad Stadium, and Sheikh Mansour and the now City Football Group have done an absolutely tremendous job since taking over at Manchester City. But part of the Red Star project?
Yeah, Michael's Red Stars project
So the vision in terms of China and how that ties in with the Chinese national team.
Yeah. Well,
with-
I mean, your comments earlier about effective communication group. Just to add one response to that, I think what you've said is absolutely right, and you've often heard me say that your generation, those born in the 90s, certainly, the late 90s, you have this wonderful advantage of immersing yourself in this digital age. You've got information at your fingertips, and that's fantastic. The internet, in general terms, is a wonderful phenomenon. I think there are some negative standpoints to it, improper use of social media, etc., etc. But you've got this wonderful source of information, and what I would argue to distinguish yourself from your peers, you mentioned the written word and the spoken word. Sometimes as simple as picking up the telephone. Everybody is communicating by posting on Facebook, tweeting on Twitter, viewing on YouTube, connecting on LinkedIn. Nobody picks up the phone anymore. And sometimes a lot of progress you can make is in these traditional communication skills, be they in the written form or the spoken form. The digital age that we all live in now is fantastic, and it gives you huge opportunities, but sometimes try and distinguish yourself, by engaging in those more traditional forms of communication. Bringing that forward to Michael's Red Stars football project, we continue to hope that his passion for the Red Stars football project that he has created with one primary colleague of his, who's done a fantastic job. It's designed to appeal to... Ordinarily, it's a 10-year project, taking children, both boys and girls, from the age of 6 to the age of 16. And fundamentally, it's there to enhance the execution of football skills and improve the standard of general performance in football more broadly. And in conducting negotiations in China, the reason there is very commercial. China, the most populated country on God's earth, I think 1.4 billion, booming economy. Now, clearly, we're sitting here in the middle of this coronavirus epidemic, which has diluted the economy somewhat, and I'm sure we're all going to come out of this. So, at the moment, things are on hold to an extent, but in recognising that the World Cup in 2022 is in Qatar. 2026, it's being shared between the United States of America, Canada and Mexico. I believe, if you look at the historical deployment of the World Cup, I suspect a World Cup back in Europe in 2030 is possible. And I just have no evidence to support this, but I just have a sneaking suspicion that maybe China might stage the World Cup in 2034. Back in 2008, they staged the Olympics. 2012, London did it very successfully. They clearly have the national pride and the revenues in its economy to fund such an event, and the belief about Michael's Red Stars project. If we can actually initiate it in 2020, the children would commence at the age of 6. Therefore, as stated earlier, it's a 10-year project to the age of 16. They'll be 16 in 2030. There would then be another 4 years before, if indeed China do stage the World Cup in 2034, those graduates from Michael's programme would be 20. And it would be very nice to think that those who graduate from his Red Stars programme would form the sort of nucleus of the Chinese national team that clearly would actually compete in the finals because it's the host nation. And the opportunities are not just limited to China. I mentioned earlier having discussions with Kuwait, which is at the other end of the scale in terms of population, just 4 million, Nigeria. But I think Michael's reputation with his career at Liverpool, Real Madrid, Manchester United, those three, I think, primarily. Obviously a tremendously successful career with England. Now a very successful businessman with his racehorse training business. But this is his passion. And I think that, over the next 10 to 20 years, Michael's Red Stars project will provide a huge opportunity for the standards in other nation states to improve. And just finally, Max, in addition to improving the execution of football skills in young children 6 to 16 in these nation states, the further and ultimate objective is that would consequentially improve the FIFA world ranking of that country. I believe that, arguably China should be number one in the world because they've got so many people to choose from, but of course culturally it's not in their history. I think China's 82, I'm not sure, Kuwait perhaps is 100 plus, Nigeria about 39. Those are the countries that we've had the discussions with, or certainly I have. The hope that ultimately their FIFA world ranking would improve. So yeah, it's a great opportunity, and Michael as an ambassador for football in England and the United Kingdom, clearly where we have a very established coaching structure anyway, and it's an opportunity to improve the standard of football across the world.
You'd like to think so.
Yeah.
You speculated on who you feel could be the potential host nations of the World Cups over the next couple of years, and as we know, for 2026 it is going to be a shared World Cup between North American nations, so the United States, Canada and Mexico.
That's right.
Something I wanted to ask you about is the commercial sports sector within the US, because recently me and a business partner are hoping to get a product out on the market given 3 months time, so we're hoping to get it out there, initially aimed at academy players within this country for the pre-season of the 2021 season, but UCFB have global summits coming up, one of which is in Toronto, obviously. I think that's June time, and there's also potential working opportunities in the US, which are obviously pending, but I am hoping to get myself over there and make some contacts, networking opportunities. I know on George Wicks Limited you've dealt with clients from the US. What has your experience been dealing with those? Because as you say, similar to China, they have such a large population. However, soccer, as they would call it, is not bred into their curriculum, as it will.
That's
They've
right.
got their more traditional American sports. How have you felt the reception towards the commercial sports sector in the US?
Well, it's America is the biggest economy in the world, very successful commercial nation in general terms, and I think historically it's down to an outstanding work ethic over many decades and 2 centuries or more. Interestingly, until I'm not sure off the top of my head when the MLS started, maybe 15 years ago. Prior to that, back in the 70s, when George Best was retiring, they had the New York Cosmos.
Who had Beckenbauer.
That's right, Beckenbauer.
Pele.
And Cruyff.
Yeah.
A good friend of mine, Milan Mandrić, who has owned Portsmouth and Sheffield Wednesday and Leicester, and current owner of Olimpia Ljubljana in Slovenia. Back in the 70s, he owned the San Jose Earthquakes. This was before the MLS was created. It was soccer, as the Americans call it, sadly. I still think it should be called football, in its infancy, and he brought George Best over to San Jose Earthquakes. So it's interesting that back in... Now, when did the Glazer family buy Manchester United? I think it was 2005, something like that. And we know they bought it on the basis of heavy borrowing, but they knew what they were buying. They were buying a global brand, arguably a bit of a cash cow, and there's no question that it's been a success from that standpoint. I know there's certain aspects of the supporter base that still object, but that's history now, and I think most economic analysts would argue that it's been a success in fundamental terms. When the Premier League was created in 92, there's no question that in the 80s and possibly most of the 90s, the primary 4 American sports franchises, so the NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA and NHL, National Hockey League, ice hockey, were 4 of the most lucrative commercial sports sectors in the world, undoubtedly. But of course, perhaps with the exception of ice hockey, which is played extensively in Europe, certainly in the Nordic countries, Russia, Eastern Europe, the NFL, there's a limited number of nations around the world that embrace it. I think Major League Baseball, I think features in Japan. NBA, basketball is clearly played across the world, in Europe, in China, but there's nothing like our traditional definition of football as opposed to the Americans' definition of soccer. And I think that when the Glazers bought Manchester United, we've since had John W. Henry, Fenway Sports, Boston Red Sox buying Liverpool, Shahid Khan, Jacksonville Jaguars buying Fulham, Stan Kroenke, LA Rams buying Arsenal, Randy Lerner, who used to own the Cleveland Browns, I think, bought Aston Villa, because they suddenly realised that those 4 historical primary franchises were no longer the most lucrative commercial sports sector in the world. And primarily because with the Premier League being broadcast in 200 plus countries, which the NFL certainly isn't, but by my understanding, if I'm proven wrong, I'm proven wrong, but I don't think it is. And therefore the value of the global broadcasting media rights is far greater. Therefore the value of the sector is far greater. And I think a further consideration, Max, to respond to your last question, is that when I mentioned with a population of 1.4 billion, China should be the number 1 country in the world, because surely there's another Messi or a Ronaldo somewhere in that 1.4 billion. But of course, it's not in the culture. It's not in the DNA of China. And arguably, it's not in the culture of the United States either, whereas NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA, and ice hockey is. But there's been a number of controversies in the NFL over recent years. Concussion. Many medical studies, to an extent more recently in our own rugby union, but certainly concussion issues and young mums with young boys in America now are not keen for them to just fall into the NFL as they would have done before, or having it coached to them at school, but they're much happier for them to engage in what they call soccer. I mean, you can break your leg in soccer, but it doesn't have that, certainly that history of concussion statistics that sadly the NFL has. And I'm not got any statistics to hand, but I believe that attendances at baseball over recent 5, 6, 7 years have plummeted, certainly in certain teams. I mean, I've been to games at the Philadelphia Phillies, and stadiums half empty. So I think that there's a number of issues in American sport which is challenging the fact that back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was undoubtedly, or those 4 traditional sectors were undoubtedly the most lucrative commercial sports sector in the world. So I think your aspiration to go to the States, where it certainly is embracing the MLS now. Beckham has just started after a 7-year project into Miami. I think that you're, coming from England with your wonderful Liverpudlian accent, being a Toffee man, obviously, an Evertonian, and the passion for what you do, with the MLS being very much now embraced, I think you would be embraced in America at a fantastic time, in consideration of everything we've just said. So I would urge you to go for it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll get back to you in 3 to 5 years' time on that one.
Yeah, let me know.
Also, as well, I find that particularly interesting about the decline in attendances of Major League Baseball games. I think when we go over to Toronto, we'll get the chance to go to a Toronto Blue Jays game. So yeah. I'll be keen to check that out. Something that you did also mention is the just continual increase of broadcast revenue of the Premier League coming in from overseas.
Yep.
Broadcasters. That is something that I'm studying my dissertation on. I think
right.
Both domestically and internationally it accumulates to £9 billion now.
Humongous.
It
And of course, we mentioned earlier, I mean, years ago, prior and around the start of the Premier League, which of course was based very much around the emergence of Sky, there was traditional terrestrial television, then satellite, cable, but now it's all streaming.
Yeah,
everyone's watching
definitely.
games.
That was what I was going to ask you about now. Like, do you attribute that just huge explosion down to broadcasting? And it very does much seem like it's going down that streaming route now with the, you know, your giants like Amazon getting on board. Broadcasting in terms of, do you have much knowledge of the broadcasting in, say, North America?
Well, I know that, I mean, clearly Facebook, Google, Amazon are, well, they're not fundamentally American companies, they are American companies. So I think we mentioned earlier, I believe I'm right in saying that if you want to watch the Premier League in India, I think the only way you can do it is on Facebook. If I've got that wrong, I apologise. And we know that there were 2 weekends in December in the Premier League where there was no Sky, there was no BT, it was on Amazon.
That was absolutely fantastic strategic placement.
No, absolutely.
Fantastic.
And although I don't have a particularly detailed knowledge of streaming services in the States, I know that the company, or if it's not the company that owns it, a significant, probably majority shareholding of the Philadelphia Flyers, which is the NHL ice hockey team. Philadelphia is one of those few cities in the States that have a representative from all 5 franchises. So they have the Philadelphia Eagles, NFL, Philadelphia Phillies,
Union,
Major League Baseball.
Yeah.
1 minute. Philadelphia 76ers, basketball, Philadelphia Flyers, ice hockey, and as you just mentioned correctly, the Philadelphia Union. And the Flyers, I'm pretty sure, are owned by Comcast. So Comcast is a media broadcast entity that owns a club. I suppose from a different standpoint, we're talking betting now, but, you know, Bet365 owns Stoke City. So commercial entities from other sectors, in Bet365's case, it's the gaming sector. In Comcast's case, it's the media broadcasting sector. They're acquiring clubs, franchises. So I'm not overly familiar with the impact that streaming services is having, but what we do know, Max, is that the digital platforms upon which people view content, you know, it's gone from big televisions to laptops to iPads to mobile phones. Personally, I don't particularly want to watch a football game on my mobile phone.
No.
I'd rather watch it on a big screen.
I'd rather be there.
Well, exactly. But clearly, there's an emerging population, emerging generation that are very happy to do that. And of course, this is a big headache for Sky and BT and Comcast in the States, because they're traditional television production companies, broadcasters, for want of a better term. So digital is the future, streaming is the future, watching it on small screens. I think maybe they'll get the mobile phones that can open up and you'll have a double-sized screen. But no, I think your aspiration to engage in the American commercial sports sector is right, and I think the timing is very good.
Thanks. And even if you say that your knowledge isn't that extensive, I think just that even that small piece of information of a multimedia company acquiring a sports team,
the Philadelphia Flyers.
I find that endlessly fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I know you told me over text this morning you've recently been in Nigeria as well. Is it completely different?
Coronavirus free.
Coronavirus
free. Doesn't seem to have got into Africa. Sorry, Africa. We were in Nigeria last week. Came back Thursday.
Nice. I worked Man City's summer schools over the summer, and I spent a lot of my summer at the academy over the road. Who one of the coaches there spent the summer in Nigeria. I asked him about it. In one word, he described it to me. He said very chaotic,
Yeah?
Would you echo that same sentiment?
Chaotic in terms of...
I'm not quite sure as to what he was dealing with. I imagine as a coach, he was obviously, coaching kids and what have you.
In the States?
In Nigeria.
Oh, in Nigeria, yes. Ah, right, sorry, yes, forgive me. Yes, I mean, it's... I mentioned I met with the Minister for Sport, and I haven't spoken to Michael Owen and his colleagues since I've been back, but the prospect, for example, in reference to your term chaotic, of bringing Michael to Lagos or Abuja, the minister thought there'd have to be extra security at the airport because they would go mad for it. They just love the Premier League, and if you look at West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, we can name outstanding players from all of those four countries.
Mm-hmm.
Togo, Emmanuel Adebayor.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we're at the location where he scored for Man City and ran up to the Arsenal fans and got himself into trouble. Togo's a tiny little country, but Premier League stars from all of those countries in West Africa, and so the Premier League in West Africa is just it's an obsession. So bringing the likes of Michael over there would be chaotic, but they are willing to embrace it. It costs money to embrace the Premier League if you want to secure an investment or promote a brand, but there is no other platform like it to expose your identity to... I think on certain weekends, maybe weekends when there's a Manchester derby like we had yesterday, or a Merseyside derby or whatever, the weekend television audience is like 1.2 billion. I mean, that's enormous. That's I'm not a great mathematician. Was that 15% to 20% of the world's population watching the Premier League? So there isn't another platform like it, which again is why the Americans have come over and started buying clubs. Whether it's Nigeria or Kuwait or wherever else we believe there's an opportunity, and the world is a big place, 54 nation states on the continent of Africa. I don't know how many are registered at the United Nations, 210, 20, 30. There's opportunities everywhere, and you're emerging into the sector at the right time.
Thanks.
No question.
Just that, and as you say, as a commercial entity, it doesn't look like there's better sectors to aim at to market your product or get your presence felt. Almost when it comes to the individuals and the people that you deal with within the sports and football sector, who is it? Is it more so owners, commercial directors?
Our relationships are with the owners, which I believe are arguably the most important relationships to have, because they're the ones that decide to spend the money or not. So whether it's from an investment standpoint, a commercial standpoint, or a football operation standpoint, to have a relationship with an owner is I think the most valued, and that tends to be where our relationships are, which we've developed and nurtured over several years now, some by design, some by chance, but they're the people that need to be engaged with if you are to progress an interest in the sector, undoubtedly. Nice.
Any particular interactions with owners that you're particularly proud of?
Well, I can tell you that I suppose like any sector, there are some owners of businesses that are very nice human beings and very successful people, and there's other owners that are less palatable, shall we say. And I'm certainly not going to highlight some of those, but I have to tell you, and I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning this, but Peter Coates, the owner of Stoke City, is just one of the nicest men you could wish to meet. An immeasurably successful gentleman, an immeasurably successful family, an immeasurably successful business, born in Stoke-on-Trent, still lives in and around the area, passionate about his city, passionate about his football club, but just a grounded man, very pleasant, gives you the time of day. Milan Mandrić, I mentioned earlier, just a very courteous gentleman. And I often hear remarks, when I comment on how much of an honour it's been to meet them, and the nice ones say, well, we would treat people as we want to be treated ourselves. So, very proud of those two associations. Just nice people. Whether they're football club owners or not, they're just nice people.
It's nice to see that localised interest and that passion almost, not viewing football ownership as a hobby, but something that comes from the heart.
Yeah, he being Peter Coates in this case is he's a Stoke City fan, born in Stoke-on-Trent, and just loves the club and has had huge success. I think, they're in the Championship now and have not had a great season. Great win on Saturday, beating Hull 5-1. But I believe I'm right in saying that they had 3 consecutive top 10 finishes in the Premier League. Mm-hmm. And I think it was 9th, and 9th, which is some achievement.
Yeah.
It's getting towards the top of those outside the top 6. They're valued relationships and not to be certainly not to be taken for granted either, but just very nice human beings. There's nothing more I can add to that.
Definitely. As you mentioned, a good weekend for Stoke just gone, and switching gears a little bit just more towards your personal interest. I know you're a big QPR fan.
Yes.
The R's. Good result at the weekend for Mark Warburton's team. I just standard questions for the podcast, that I do feel like it's a very interesting touch point to ask some of my guests.
Yep.
What is the best match that you've ever been to?
Wow. A QPR game?
It could be any, but I'd imagine because you are a big QPR
be any,
fan,
yeah.
probably be it.
There's so many. I've seen them at Wembley in a couple of cup finals, which we lost, but we famously to us, beat Derby in the playoff final.
Is that the Bobby Zamora?
Bobby Zamora goal. I mean, we got battered in that game. Should not have won it, and a dreadful error by Richard Keogh. Just handed the ball to Bobby Zamora in the 94th, 95th minute. Obviously a great game. But I think I go back to the 70s, where our arch rivals, and for QPR fans, they are still our arch rivals, even though to the team I'm about to disclose, they don't really give a monkeys about us, are Chelsea. I mean, geographically, we're like 1.5 miles or 2 miles down the road, but since Roman Abramovich, as I say, that's apparently how you're supposed to pronounce it, since he bought Chelsea, they're a different entity, European Champions League winners, Europa League winners, a good handful of Premier League titles. But I mean, back in the 70s, we used to beat them mercilessly. And I can remember a 2-0 victory at Stamford Bridge in the quarterfinals of the League Cup. We went on to beat Liverpool, which you'll be happy about, over 2 legs in the semi-final. And we then went on to play Oxford United in what was the Milk Cup final in 1986, still the League Cup final, as the overwhelming favourites, having won at Stamford Bridge in the quarterfinals, beaten Liverpool over 2 legs against Oxford United, and we got stuffed 3-0. So that quarterfinal win at Stamford Bridge. But I think as I've sat here listening to your question, there was an Easter Monday, couldn't tell you the date, but it was Easter Monday, and I'm pretty sure it was 1986, because Chelsea are our arch enemies. On Easter Monday, we beat Chelsea 6-0. And I think, that one.
Fair shout.
That one.
Fair shout. Any mention of Chelsea at the moment kind of gets
well,
me
yes, I'm
agitated.
sorry, you've been an Everton fan.
Everton got trounced by them 4-0 at the weekend.
And a certain Mr. Barkley playing as well.
Of course, he did play quite well.
He did.
Is there any individual player that you've seen that you just classes out of this world?
That's an easy one to answer. And the gentleman I'm about to mention is a good friend. Very sadly, He's got acute dementia now. We're going back to the 70s. You won't be surprised to learn it's a QPR player. Stan Bowles. He was the guest of honour at my 40th. And to me, he didn't have a left foot. He had a wand. I mean, just, probably for you as a young man, you think, Stan Bowles? Who's Stan?
It rings a bell.
Look him up on the internet. And like many players of his era and since, so his era would have been Alan Hudson, Frank Worthington, Stan Bowles, Tony Curry, players with immeasurable talent. And Stan only got 5 caps. I mean, that's, Alf Ramsey and I think Don Revie at the time. These are the players that in those days liked to drink, liked to gamble. Their social life was a bit, all over the shop, for want of a better term. But my word, playing between 3 o'clock and 20 to 5, as it was back in, there was no Sunday games. He was just amazing. And Stan, Loftus Road, I think I told you, is located in the middle of a housing estate in the borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, but 100 metres from Loftus Road Stadium. Now, it's not there now, but back in the 70s was the White City Stadium, famous stadium where I think the 1948 Olympics were held. As I say, it's not there, but in the 70s it was a dog track, and up until about 2:45, Stan would be up there placing bets, and he would run down the South Africa Road, put his boots on and have a fag and go out. I mean, would be unheard of now. Would be unheard of. But just a character. He was just fabulous. And I think, in the 80s and the 90s, the likes of Paul Gascoigne. I think Gascoigne probably got 30-odd caps. But again, his ability warranted more. But, unfortunately, his private life perhaps imposed some limitations on that. But Stan Bowles was just the man.
I love hearing about that.
He wrote a book, Stan the Man.
Nice.
There's a book, Stan the Man.
I'll check it out.
Yeah.
I love hearing stories about the era of the 70s and 80s, as although there wasn't the same, how do you say it, commercial potential as there is now within football.
Yeah.
Hearing the stories, obviously from my own family, about the European trips of Everton. Just the
was it 80? When did you win the league?
84, 85.
And then the Cup Winners' Cup.
Yep.
Sheedy.
Yep.
Adrian Heath.
There's a film that's come out recently called Everton's Howard's Way, which is a film that's
Howard Kendall.
predicated on that winning side. I'm actually going to a screening of that.
Andy Gray.
On Sunday, I've met and interviewed Andy Gray. And see a couple of members of that squad again on Sunday. I'm very much looking forward to it. Another one of the sport and related questions. Have you got a favourite goal that springs to mind?
I think Stan would have scored many that I can recall, but I probably have to say, especially as I've worked with him a little bit, Michael Owen's goal at the 1998 World Cup final against Argentina.
Was that the game that Beckham got sent off?
Yeah.
I was born that day.
You were born that day?
Yeah.
You were born the day that Beckham got sent off,
Yeah.
my word.
22nd of August.
Do you know who the player was that Beckham fouled?
Simeone.
Yeah. And I think now was 4 years. So England played Argentina. Owen scored that wonderful goal. And we lost on penalties, didn't we? Even though Sol Campbell scored a perfectly legitimate goal in injury time, we would have won 3-2, but anyway, that's another story. But 4 years later, when the World Cup was shared between Japan and South Korea, England played Argentina in the group stages. And Michael Owen, and that we won 1-0, so it was revenge for 4 years earlier. It was a Beckham penalty, but it was awarded because Michael Owen got fouled in the penalty area. And do you know who fouled him?
Diego Simeone?
I think it was Mauricio Pochettino.
Oh, was it? Wow.
I think so. Well, Pochettino was definitely in that game, and he had long hair.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he's a young man. Definitely Beckham fouled Simeone to get sent off during the game when Michael Owen scored that great goal on the day you were born. 4 years later, we beat them 1-0, Beckham penalty. Definitely Michael Owen was the one that was fouled. Was it Pochettino? Pochettino was in that game. He was a central defender.
Okay.
So we'll have to check that out.
I will do.
I'll have to check that out.
That's interesting. And something else, just to wind up the podcast, and I've not mentioned it to you, but the little clip that you show at the end of your lectures, I forget the gentleman's name. Do you know off the top of your head?
Rear Admiral William H. McRaven.
That's the
one.
one.
The Power of Hope.
Where during a speech, he very, some would assume, softly starts off by saying, "Make your bed." But
if you want to change the world, start off by making your bed.
If you want to change the world, start off by making your bed.
Yeah.
That ties in very nicely with a book I've recently read by a Canadian psychologist called Jordan Peterson. The book called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos. And each chapter is essentially a rule to follow.
Mm-hmm.
One of those chapters is titled "Set Your House in Perfect Order Before You Criticize the World." And one of the things that he does say is,
it's very true,
tidying your room is the catalyst for going on to making such changes. Is that something that you draw a lot of inspiration from?
Well, yeah, I do. I mean, I think I said to you, I it's a 6-minute video, and at the end of a bad day, and we all have bad days, I often, lie in bed, put my head on the pillow, and hold the mobile phone above my head and just watch this 6-minute video. And, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It's very, very true. And what he's saying is, if you, rather than leaving your bed in the morning and leaving it like a pit, if you go through the task of just making it and puffing the pillows up and leaving it all nice, then I think, as he said, even if you have a bad day, you come home to a bed that is made. Now, I mean, it's a very simplistic view, and as you hear at the beginning of the 6-minute video, when he first mentions this, people chuckle because they think, what are you talking about? Change the world by making your bed. But it's just substantiate the point that he's making. Be disciplined. And I think the end, it concludes in the power of hope. And the way I conclude the seminars is just to give my brief snippets of advice on how best to approach each day, approach life, and give yourself the best opportunity to succeed.
Definitely. Ian, I would just like to thank you very much for your time, because I know you are a very busy man, and having the opportunity to sit down and talk to someone like yourself is something that means an awful lot to me. So, as I say,
perhaps you can send me a copy of it.
Yeah, I will do. Most definitely, I'll get it over to you. So, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Carlyle Podcast, and make sure to stay tuned for more.